Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to tackle something pretty big. How to read one of the most influential books in the world, not through our modern eyes, but on its own ancient terms.
All right, so where do we even start? Let's kick things off with a really fundamental question. The whole idea we're exploring today hinges on this, the difference between just reading the Bible and actually studying it. And it's a bigger difference than you might think. So think of it like this. On one hand, you've got Bible reading, and a lot of the time, that's kind of passive, right? We're taking in the words through our modern translations and our own church traditions. But then there's Bible study, and that's a whole different game. That's about actively hunting for what these words meant to the people who first wrote and heard them in their world.
And look, this isn't just some dusty academic argument. The source we're looking at says this gap, it's created a persistent methodological crisis. That's a fancy way of saying we've got a real, ongoing problem that leads to major misunderstandings of what the biblical authors were even trying to say.
This gets us to the heart of the matter, what's called the foreign context problem. Here's the deal. We can't help it, right? Every single one of us reads a text through our own modern eyes. But our world, our science, our politics, our questions, is totally foreign to the world that produced these ancient texts.
Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the solution? How do we possibly bridge this massive gap? Well, the approach we're digging into today lays out a three-pillar solution. Think of it as a framework for becoming, well, a kind of cultural time traveler, so we can finally read the text in its world, not ours.
All right, let's jump into that first pillar. This is all about diving headfirst into the world the biblical writers actually lived and breathed in.
And this timeline, wow, it just lays it all out, doesn't it? The sheer amount of time we're talking about is staggering. The Old Testament was born in the ancient Near East, the world of Babylon and Egypt. The New Testament comes out of Second Temple Judaism. If we're reading it all through the lens of the 16th century Reformation, or even our 21st century world, we're basically asking questions that would have made no sense to the original authors.
So the big takeaway for this first pillar is pretty simple, but it's huge. To really get the Bible, we have to meet it on its turf. We have to learn its way of thinking, its symbols, its stories, instead of trying to cram it into our own boxes. Okay, let's move on to pillar number 2, which builds right on top of that. This one is all about literary forms, or you could say reading the mail correctly. I mean, you wouldn't read a poem the same way you read a legal contract, right? Different kinds of writing have different rules.
And getting the genre wrong can lead to some pretty big misunderstandings. Take Proverbs, for instance. We often read them like they're absolute promises from God, but they were intended as wise general observations. Or think about apocalyptic literature, like the Book of Revelation. People try to read it like a coded timeline of future events, but it was really a symbolic way of talking about God's work in the world.
Okay, here's a fantastic real-world example. The Book of Numbers. It talks about the Israelites in the wilderness, and the numbers add up to millions of people. For modern historians, this is a huge logistical and archaeological puzzle. I mean, how would that even work? But what if? What if we're not even supposed to read it that way?
Well, what if it's not a modern census at all? The argument here is that this text actually fits perfectly into a genre called an ancient Near Eastern military annal. In that kind of writing, huge numbers weren't about a literal head count. They were a symbolic way to brag about your king's power or show that the gods were on your side.
And boom, just like that, by getting the genre right, the problem just evaporates. The point was never about giving us precise census data. It was about making a powerful rhetorical claim about God's incredible power and how he provided for his people. The genre is everything.
And that brings us to our third and final pillar, being disciplined with the words themselves. This is all about what individual words actually mean in their own context, and avoiding some really common but pretty misleading traps. Okay, one of the biggest ones you hear all the time is something called the root fallacy. You've probably heard this before, the idea that a word's real, secret meaning is hidden in its ancient root. But here's the thing, linguists will tell you again and again, that is just not how language works. Meaning comes from how a word is used right here and now, not from its family tree. And this slide gives the perfect, and I mean perfect, example. It's a classic sermon illustration. The Greek word for power is dunamis. Sound familiar? Dynamite. So the power of God must be explosive, right? Except, dynamite was invented in 1867. A first-century writer like Paul would have had no clue what dynamite was. For him, dunamis just meant power or ability. End of story. All right, so with that in mind, let's apply this kind of discipline to one of the most significant words in the whole Bible, bara. It's the very first verb in Genesis, translated as created. So, what's the real story with this word?
So a really common idea is that bara means to create something out of absolutely nothing. But when you look closely at the text itself, it kind of pushes back on that idea. For one thing, it uses another word, asa, which just means to make, for the same event. Plus, it says humans were made from stuff that was already there, dust, a rib. So if it's not about creating from nothing, what's so special about this word? Well, when you look at all of its uses, over 50 of them in the Hebrew Bible, an absolutely jaw-dropping pattern emerges. The one doing the barying is always and only God. No human ever baras. No animal. Just God. So here's the punchline. The real significance of the word bara isn't a statement about physics or material origins. It's a statement about who is doing the creating. It's a theological claim about divine sovereignty. When the text uses that word, it's shouting, this is an act that only God can do.
Okay, so when you put all three of these pillars together, the foreign context, the literary forms, and the meaning of the words, it really does change everything about how you approach the text. It's a whole new way of seeing things.
You shift from what's called proof texting, where you start with a belief and then go hunting for verses to back it up, to something completely different. You start with the text itself, reading it carefully, and you let the big, deep, theological patterns and ideas just emerge from the ground up.
And this quote right here just nails the biggest change in perspective. When a passage is weird, it is important. Strangeness is a hermeneutical signal, not a problem. I mean, think about that. Those parts of the Bible that make you scratch your head, they aren't bugs, they're features. They're giant blinking signs telling us, hey, your modern assumptions don't work here. Pay attention.
And that leaves us with this final question. Because in the end, this whole approach isn't really about finding all the right answers. It's about learning to ask better questions. It's about having the humility to step out of our own world and just listen, to let this ancient, complex, and sometimes very strange library of texts finally speak for itself. What might we find if we do?